In Diablo 2, one of the more overlooked runeword categories is the staff. This is mostly because shields add a ton to your durability and can get some pretty great mods. That said, there is room in the arsenal to consider staves for a few odd builds, both caster and melee. As usual, not everything in this video is going to be put into a staff because, well, I'm not made of runes, and while I have a stock of most bases, I don't want to burn them on things I won't use. But each and every one of these will work in a staff if you assemble them properly. First up, as usual, we're going to knock out the stuff that you very likely will not want to make, starting with Call to Arms. Again, we place this one low because it just flat out goes better in one-handed weapons for pretty much every use case you can imagine. And costing Am, Ral, Mal, Ist, and Om, you usually won't want to waste those runes because they're not all super cheap. And while this does pack good mods, it'll pack those same good mods on a one-hander that you can use a shield with. Next up to be knocked out is Fortitude, also one of the usual don't do this type runewords, albeit for weapons in general. And that's because it also works in armor and won't result in enemies running away, at least not there. Also costing El, Sol, Dole, and Low, it makes it a little rough to make too many of until you've been around the game for a while, because low runes are fairly uncommon despite their name. In short, it doesn't have terrible mods, it's just better in armor. These next two should also be familiar, starting with Venom, Tal, Dole, and Mal. This will work in a staff, but generally speaking as a base, it's one of the worst for this already kinda bad runeword, since there's little to no builds that can realistically take advantage of it in a two-handed melee weapon with any level of efficiency. The other one is Wind, Sir and El, the runeword that would be fun if it was cheaper. Unfortunately, it's basically packing nightmare weapon stats in a hell difficulty level requirement. It does have nice mods with attack speed, run walk speed, some damage, blind, and a chance to hit modifiers, but in the end, it just can't quite live up to the similarly priced alternatives, especially on a two-handed weapon. This next one I'm going to throw down low because I absolutely hate the idea of it in a staff, and it's Passion. Using Dole, Ort, Eld, and Lem, it's not the most ungodly expensive thing, but due to that flee from Dole, and the fact that generally you're not going to be doing a ton of damage with Zeal Staff, you're going to get more frustration than use out of this unless you're very specifically built for it, and usually not even then. Save this one for one-handed weapons with shields. Usually for me that means a phase blade for just sheer speed with it. Next, we'll start moving into the affordable melee runewords, things you might use early on or that you could use if you're doing a pure staff playthrough, starting with Strength. Using Am and Tyr, this is a relatively affordable weapon early on, gives some crushing blow, some stats, and life leech. So overall, it's not bad for melee, and if you throw it in a short staff with a druid, it isn't terrible early on either. Could you fit into better bases? Yes, but it will work in a staff fairly well compared to similar early competition in two-handers at least. In a similar, but possibly weaker boat is Malice. Usually better in other weapons, but it can be fine in a staff. I wouldn't say it's actually necessarily that much weaker than Strength, but a lot cheaper at Ith, El, and Eth. Its main use is delivering bleed and doing a bit of damage on the side. Though you probably do want to be careful of what life drain you get, unless you're really prepared for it, especially since you'll be killing a little bit slower using a staff instead of other weapons. In contrast, probably at the top of the cheapo pile is Honor, costing an Am, El, Ith, Tyr, and Sol. You will need a War Staff for this, but it is at least a +1 skills that you can whack stuff with. Would I say this is really that great? Not really, since you can easily beat it with a Spirit Sword, which is even cheaper to make, and just as easy to kind of get the base for, while only taking one hand. That said, if you are going for an early staff melee kind of character, and don't have better, this could actually carry you a bit of the way if you get the right staff. With those done, now we move into the big split in staves, the melee staves and the caster staves. It's arguable as to which one is more worthwhile, but I find myself using staves more for melee in late post-game than I find myself using them for spells, since my main uses for them are for tests on Fury Druids, Enchantresses, and Blunt Weapon Barbarians, since, well, the Barbarian Mace Mastery actually applies to staves as well, and you can use them at exceptionally low strength values, but your personal mileage may actually vary. So on the 5 on the melee branch, we'll start with Fury. Easily my least favorite of the 5 I've set aside for this, costing Jaw, Gull, and Eth. It's still not terrible as it has good increased attack speed, damage, ignore target defense, deadly strike, and life leech, among other things. It's just it doesn't feel nearly as good as it does in one-handed weapons. That said, it does work okay on Fury Druids, though it does get quite expensive to repair. Next, we have Eternity, which would be higher if it had increased attack speed or was a bit cheaper, but costing Am, Bear, Ist, Soul, and Sur, it's a bit pricey. That said, it has a very nice list of mods and can be slammed into an Ethereal Archon staff for very low strength requirements, fairly high damage, and it also packs Crushing Blow and Life Leech. This is far from a bad melee staff and can be a lot of fun to mess around with, but I actually put it low because there's a better option that's about as expensive that actually has increased attack speed. Before we get to the Eternity alternative, we should look at a few of the dedicated Enchantress options though, starting with Hand of Justice. Increased attack speed, Holy Fire, decent damage, ignore target defense, Life Leech, and several other fun mods. This one is actually a lot of fun on an Enchantress, especially against enemies that are not fire immune. Though it is pretty pricey, costing Sur, Cham, Am, and Low, pretty much relegating it to late post-game type builds and mostly just for fun. Similarly expensive is Phoenix. Vex, Low, Jaw. It is very much similar to Hand of Justice, at least in how it feels, and it's honestly better in some ways, worse than others. It packs a bit more punch and a bigger reduction to enemy fire resist, as well as fairly handy redemption aura. I would say it sits in the realm of personal preference which one of the two you prefer, since they both sit nearly at the same space and have similar playstyle on Staves, though this one does have Firestorm on attack, which does get boosted from Fire Mastery on a Sorceress or Fire Synergies on a Druid, but it's not quite as fast as the Hand of Justice there. And now we get to the fifth and last melee staff, which you can see I did finally give in and just put in a staff because I already have the other fun bases, and that is Breath of the Dying. Yes, it can go on Staves. With only 2 expensive runes, since it costs Vex, Hell, Eld, Zod, and Eth, it's actually on par or debatably cheaper than the other melee options, and has a handful of really fun mods. Slapped on an Ethereal Archon staff, it pretty much matches an Ethereal Ogre Maul in damage output, but requires a puny 18 strength to use, and will give you 30 of all attributes on top of that, including all the other nice mods you can see right here. But as much as I love melee on a staff, we do have to move over to the caster branch. I've set aside 5 staves here as well, and we'll start with Insight. Yes, it can go in staves, not just polearms, and it's relatively cheap at Ral, Tyr, Tal, and Soul. While Spirit will generally do better, it's still not terrible, especially if you pair it with a staff that has a good base plus skill. And it could get you a fair ways in without relying on a mercenary meditation, though you usually are better off letting your mercenary have it in a polearm and using Spirit yourself. Next up is another one of those runewords you might not have thought of for this, and that's Silence. Plus 2 all skills, 75% resist all, 2 mana per kill, and a pinch of magic find. Is it better than Spirit? Usually no, but those resistances are still fairly solid, even at the cost of Dole, Eld, Hell, Ist, Tyr, and Vex. Would I recommend it for a new player? Probably not. But I would definitely consider it if I was doing a staff-only challenge, and it would honestly only potentially be beaten out by our next 2 options. The first of which is Memory. Lum, Io, Soul, and Eth. Packing 3 all skills, well, 3 sorceress skills, 33% faster cast rate, mana increase, a few plus skills like just rando sorceress ones, which as you can see, you can stack on top of other plus skills. Is it endgame GG? Not really, but it is plus 3 skills for low strength, which might be an argument for it instead of Spirit. The big downside is Resist though, which you can get while wielding dual Spirit, albeit at significantly higher strength requirements since, this one costs, well, 0 strength in this one's case. The other one, which answers that resistance question, is Heart of the Oak. While it doesn't have the addition of any class-specific skills, it does do pretty much all the same things as Memory with plus 3 all skills, except this one's all skills, 40% faster cast rate, mana bump, but also throws in a 30 to 40% resist all on top of that, essentially making it the best of both worlds between Silence and Memory. Sure, it costs Ko, Vex, Pull, and Thol, and it is generally better in a flail, as you can see we have it here in a flail, but in a staff, it does stay competitive with the other staff options, at least in the caster space, though, as I said, I generally prefer staves for melee, oddly enough. And last but not least, and it doesn't really beat Heart of the Oak, but it is one that you're going to be using a lot more in staves than Heart of the Oak, The staff that I weirdly use more than any other staff in the game, and that's because it is my default weapon for late normal and early nightmare for half the classes in the game. And that is Leaf, costing tier and Rawl. It's one of those weapons that if you ever plan on playing a druid, a sorceress, or an assassin in the early game, it's worthwhile to make from any garbage 2-socket staff you can find. It's also semi-useful for a chippy farmer paladin unless you just respec a higher level one with dual spirits. Do you run staves on any of your characters? Which ones do you run? Mention them down below and it might make its way into a build video too. As always, a special thanks to the patrons and channel members who make all this possible, and keep gaming, have fun, and peace out. This has been Alzorath. Bye.